Okay, let's get started. Hello and good morning. I am very happy to see that there are still here people on Friday, so fantastic. And I'm very excited about our panel today. For those of you who don't know me yet, I think I've met many of the people here already, but I am Sabhana Zrishidia. I am with the TED Global Institute. We are a not-for-profit that focuses on Global South, digital rights, and policy issues, and I'm very excited to be moderating this panel and being joined by a fantastic set of panelists, both in person and online. We have about 90 minutes together, and we're going to divide this time up with some conversations with the panelists, as well as an opportunity for the audience here, as well as online, to ask us some questions. So on that note, maybe I can start by introducing our panelists, and then moving on to kind of talking a little bit more about the discussion topic today, which is something that's top of mind for all of us, which is digital public infrastructure, a topic that has been actually started by the Indian presidency of the G20 and has really moved on from there through Brazil and now South Africa, is now also a major topic of the Freedom Online Coalition, which is where we are. I'm an advisory network member. A number of other global processes where DPI is increasingly coming up, whether that's the GDC, whether that is to some of the work from UNDP and a number of other sort of UN bodies and UN processes. So this is an important topic, especially for those of us who are in the global majority. And I'm sure many of our panelists will have lots to say about that as well. So on that note, I am going to start with some of my panelists here. From the extreme left of me is Rasmus Lumi, who is the Director General of the Department of International Organizations and Human Rights at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Estonia. Then we have Luca Belli, who is a professor at FGV Law School, Rio de Janeiro, and Director of the Center for Technology and Society. We then have Smriti Parshira, Research Fellow at the Interledger Foundation, who is also co-convening this panel with the Freedom Online Coalition. We then have Shiobhadra Singh, who is the Principal Advisor for the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India. That's our in-person panelists, and online we're being joined by Mr. Armando Manzueta, who is the Vice Minister for Public Innovation and Technology at the Ministry of Public Administration of the Dominican Republic, Keith Breckenridge, who is the Standard Bank Chair in African Trust Infrastructures at the University of Witwatersrand, South Africa. I feel like I butchered that name, but hopefully Keith will correct me. As well as Vidisha Chaudhary, who's the Assistant Professor of Government, Information Cultures and Digital Citizenship at the University of Amsterdam. So a star-studded panel, as we say, but I'll probably get started on us. As I was saying that digital public infrastructure, and I was actually just in a panel right before, where we also quite talked about, how do we think about DPI, not just within the context of specific processes, but perhaps all processes. And we're discussing that in the context of the G7 presidency as well, where it hasn't really come up as much as a priority, but there's real opportunity for that, particularly because this is such an important issue for the global majority. But oftentimes, as we think about digital public infrastructure, there's a bit of a tension, because in many ways, this is a technology that's deeply national in many ways, right? Because it is about building for your national citizen databases, looking into various national processes, and really strengthening the role of the public sector in delivering services and opportunities for its citizens. But increasingly, these national processes are also becoming, because of they're part of these global dialogues and global sort of conversations right now, there is an increasing need to find a common language around DPI. DPIs can be of many shapes, forms. We still are lacking a very universal definition of DPI. I think we are maybe at the tail end of that debate now, which is great. But that was a major issue of discussion for several years. But because so many countries are finding their own adoption models, thinking through their own public infrastructures, there is increasingly a need for thinking, what is the universal element of it? Are there certain principles that ties DPS across different kinds of countries? How do you think about governance in this space? And are these governance sort of approaches cross-border? Should they be cross-border? Can they be cross-border? And what are some of the political contexts, the social context driving DPI? Because we want, while we want DPIs to be interoperable within national boundaries, we also want them to have some level of interoperability within international borders as well, because the whole point is to really tackle the data fragmentation problem, tackle some of the e-gov fragmentation problems. So there's a lot of promise there. So those are some of the, I guess, topics that I hope we'll be discussing today, but that's sort of the context and backdrop within which that we're I'm having this conversation. I would also like to flag that as part of the Freedom Online Coalition, Estonia has been, during their chairship, leading on the rights-respecting DPI principles effort as well, that Rasmus will speak about, which is also one way of really helping us think through those universal principles. So on that note, maybe I will start with Luca, actually, who's here with us today. Maybe share a little bit more about, what do you think are some of the social, political, economic incentives driving DPI adoption in countries? And perhaps, what are some of the considerations that governments and other stakeholders should be having when they're thinking about implementing DPI?
Thank you very much for inviting me here and for organizing this very timely discussion. And let me also clarify that most of the thoughts I'm going to share are the result of our empirical research in one of our flagship projects at the center, which is called Cyber BRICS, that analyzes the digital policies of the BRICS grouping. And so we have been analyzing data governance, cybersecurity, digital transformation, and AI governance over the past 7 years in the various phases. And a parallel theme that has emerged is the theme of digital sovereignty, which is what has led that to analyze even more in-depth DPIs. And let me tell you why. So we have recently published a book, which is online in open access on the site of the editor, Cambridge University Press, on digital sovereignty in the BRICS. And by analyzing how the BRICS grouping have shaped the narrative, the initiative on digital sovereignty, you immediately understand that there is an ample spectrum of initiatives. Some of them are those initiatives that we analyze, but we do not recommend to reproduce, that flirt with authoritarianism or protectionism. Some others are some very interesting initiatives that I define as good digital sovereignty, that basically utilize the construction of technology to foster competition, to foster domestic innovation, and to empower people. And one of the very good examples of this is a digital public infrastructure we use in Brazil for online payments, PIX. I'm not sure if everyone knows it, but the Brazilian Central Bank has implemented since 2020 this digital public infrastructure, and why this is a very good example of good digital sovereignty, and why this is something that automatically triggers, from our experience, user empowerment, innovation, and competition, and also taxation of the innovation that is developed domestically. Before the PIX in Brazil, the only way we had in Brazil to perform electronic payments was through Visa and MasterCard. So we were totally dependent on a duopoly, two companies that are foreign companies, nothing against, I have literally zero against them, but they charge between 3% and 5% for every transaction. So in every country, the consumers pay 3 to 5%, the economy transfers 3 to 5% of each transaction to Visa and MasterCard, if you are dependent on them. So since the Brazilian Central Bank that has developed the PIX with a multi-stakeholder effort with dialogue with specialists and also with banks and financial intermediaries, and also implements it through a multi-stakeholder process, because there is something called the PIX Forum, where all the implementers, the financial sector representatives can participate and explain what are the problems and how they are innovating through this. So since this has been implemented, not only the duopoly has been broken, which is something that we should really celebrate, and our antitrust authority, through conventional means, would have never been able to do this. The duopoly has been broken by creating an alternative, and that is extremely powerful. And the result is not only that this has automatically reverted in the pockets of cost of customers 3 to 5%, which is already something stellar, but also that this has distributed data collection. So people do not realize that over the past 10 years, Visa and MasterCard have become big data companies. So the main part of their revenue is not the 3 to 5% they collect per transaction, is the data they collect and they process, and thanks to which they generate AI and new services that usually also is the intellectual property of which is usually then delocalized to fiscal heavens like the Cayman Islands and the Virgin Islands. So what is interesting here is not only that the customer welfare is increased, but also that the competition is automatically enhanced, innovation is produced, and data governance is distributed. And the local entrepreneurs that innovate thanks to this, then they have to pay taxes in Brazil. So we have a very different dynamic here of empowerment through DPIs. So that is why we really see this as an incredible example of good digital sovereignty that actually Brazil has to some extent copied from India. India has UPI, and actually it's an untold story that we recount in our book that India to some extent took inspiration from Russia, another BRICS country that in 2014, after he invaded for the first time Ukraine, annexing Crimea, was blocked from the first sanction was the blockage of Visa and MasterCard. From overnight, they had to create a new system. It's called Mir, like the space station, but it is based on a card. So it's a very 20th century conception of it. The great innovation of the Indians has been leveraging their skills and do it a software-based digital public infrastructure. And I think to some extent, Brazil has enhanced it, because if you look at the Indian example, that is something that, in our observation, makes it much easier to implement DPIs, so to delegate them to the implementation, at least, to a non-public stakeholder. In India is the National Payment Corporation of India, which is a foundation, which is much more agile in implementing things than bureaucracies, and everyone knows the limits of government and bureaucracy in this sense. But I think that what is the problem here is that if you want to file a freedom of access to information in India, so let's say that you're a user and you want to know which data it's collected about you and which are the data security measures implemented, they can reply to you, well, we are sorry, this is not a public organ, this is a foundation, so we are not bound by freedom of access to information. And I think that this could be easily improved in India, but so far I have this criticism, the only criticism I actually have on the UPI in India. In Brazil, this has been improved because it is it's a truly public service. It's not something public only because it is publicly accessible. It's public because it's the government that delivers it. And so if I file a freedom of access to information request to the Brazilian Central Bank, they have to reply me. Otherwise, I sue them. And they have to, at that point, they will have to reply me. So if I, as a Brazilian citizen, I want to know which kind of data are collected and what are the measures, they need to tell me. So it's much more performing in terms of accountability. So I think that for all these reasons, I think that there is a lot of room for considering DPI something very good for digital sovereignty, for good digital sovereignty, but also there are some limits, and so we should not praise them as if it was a religion, but be very pragmatic and analyze the fact. Thank you.
Thanks, Luca. That was very helpful. And I think perhaps that's where I would love to kind of bring in Keith from online. In terms of, Luca talked about a little bit about sort of, both the promise of DPI, but also the pragmatism associated with it, and the fact that, there's a very positive example for Brazil, but I know from your research in South Africa, there has also been a different set of results. So I'm curious, Keith, if you could share a little bit more about what your experience has been from the old age of IDs, digital IDs, and now, the new shiny DPI, what some of those learnings and experiences has been from South Africa, and perhaps what are some of the political and socioeconomic contexts within which DPIs are existing in the global majority.
Thank you. Yeah, it is very interesting. Thanks very much for the invitation. So DPI has come to South Africa through the G20 and the Gates Foundation and Operation Vulindlela. It's coming in from the top of the bureaucracy. But many of the things that people think about as being kind of benefits of DPI have existed in South Africa for a long time, as they have in other places. I'm not suggesting we're the only ones who've had that. So we've had a digital system for welfare distribution since the early 1990s, in fact, a little bit older than that, and a biometric population register that covers everybody. At least you can say it's been in place for about 20 years. And both of these things interact with the payment system. They do not work in real time. There are all sorts of kind of clunky bits and pieces of it that don't work well. I will say DPI is a big improvement on the plan that was in place in South Africa 3 or 4 years ago, which was one aimed at moving the population register into the security cluster. So it was all about basically targeting people who were in the officials' minds were illegally in South Africa. So migrants in particular were going to be hunted down using high-resolution ID photographs and a CCTV network. All of this done with the support of the contracting companies. I won't name them here, but they were selling that as a kind of resource to the bureaucracy. So DPI is comparatively wonderful. I mean, it's a much better system, much better plan. And I think there are lots of things that DPI can do that would be excellent. In the plans, at least, especially the UPI plans, we see space for enabling intermediaries, for example, letting people act as what we would call fiduciaries. And there's possibility to build that out so that, in fact, it's not a question of very under-equipped poor people confronting a powerful state and not being able to get any answers or remedies at the moment. But the big kind of takeaway benefit that people keep pushing for DPI, which is really about access and financial inclusion, I mean, those things have been in place in South Africa for a long time, for generations. There's no big payoff in that area. I'm really skeptical that there are benefits for poor people of real-time settlement. I think there's actually this risk there. I don't think it's a benefit. And I think we really have to ask some hard questions about financial inclusion. I'm sorry, I can see, I mean, I do understand. If you look at my work, you'll see a lot of benefits to this, but we have to ask what's happening now. And financial inclusion is not doing what people promise for it. It is, again, something that we've seen for a while. We're at least a decade into mass financial inclusion. It's encouraging usurious lending. There's no asset creation. People are borrowing at 1% a day. And they're being kind of pushed into a blacklisting engine that says if you don't pay, we're going to block you out of ever accessing the formal credit system. The biggest problem in South Africa people don't want to talk about is online gambling. So now people accessing the payment system, using the gambling apps. It's just truly astonishing. 1 trillion rand was spent on online gambling systems in 2023. That's a third of GDP. 1/3 of GDP spent on gambling, and the tax collector is kind of complicit in this process because they take a big chunk of that and put it into, so it's like a hidden digital tax. And there are lots of risks for families here too that people, well, but people don't want to talk about it while we're talking about designing a more and more expansive system to make people visible on these networks. So there's back-end hacking, people breaking into, this happens in South Africa. I've yet to see what it looks like anywhere else. So when people break in, they steal the encryption codes and they can essentially help themselves to people's online accounts. Lots of examples of that. We have lots of examples, as everybody else does, of what we call pig butchering, people being kind of seduced into giving away their money to sometimes members of the family, but sometimes people they meet online. And all of that worry, that kind of fear of the dangers of moving the poor into the payment system was before the Trump administration, right? Which has now seen a wholesale withdrawal from the regulatory state. And you know what this looks like. I'm not going to repeat it, but the key institutions, the SEC, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and probably more important than anything else for us was this Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which made companies that behave badly literally hand themselves into the Department of Justice in the United States. And that's a wide range. There are dozens of companies that did this, including some famous examples from Brazil. And that kind of regulatory, what everyone calls it, context, is disappeared. All right, so if we don't ignore all of these problems, what should we be doing? That's, I suppose, the question. And the fundamental issue really has to be making the what we could call metrics of exclusion much more visible. So while we're talking about DPI, what happens with DPI is we make credit scores visible. That's the big driver. So companies can now build either their own system or they can share data, and it puts individuals in a, truthfully, I'm not sure they're the beneficiaries of this. I'm not sure that financial inclusion, there's not much evidence. There's a lot of good evidence that, in fact, the overwhelming effect of a kind of mass digital lending system is actually increasing poverty. It's not fixing the problem. So exclusion and metrics and publishing that. There should be immediately on the website, it should be, this is the number of people whose identity numbers are at the moment disabled. And this is how long it's taking for us to basically answer queries around those numbers. I can tell you what this looks like in South Africa. There was a court case last year in January where the Department of Home Affairs admitted that 2 million identity numbers had been turned off. Now, turning off in our current system just involves editing literally a comment field on the 3rd page of the population register, and that disables the identity number from functioning. It means you cannot access, can't register the birth of your child, can't bury your parents, can't access a bank account, you cannot function digitally. All these Estonian, the capacities people like to talk about, they're very easily switched off in the current system, and that needs to be much more carefully regulated. So officials who edit the population register, they need to be subject to exactly the same kind of oversight as the people who are being essentially identified by it. So, and then I'd say the third big issue is making space for what we could call trusted fiduciaries. I think it has to be more than lawyers. These have to be officials almost, or semi-private officials who are self-regulated in the first instance, who can interact with this DPI engine. The nicest example of how this actually works in South Africa are the undertakers. So that, we have excellent death registration and very quick, well-handled death documentation that when someone dies, they get very quickly documented. And the reason is that undertakers earn a fortune from putting bodies in the ground, and they've been granted access to the population register in order to speed up that whole process. But we need something like that that helps when you go to get an identity document and you see that the population register has misspelt your name, mischaracterized your gender, there are so many mistakes. Once you've lived with a big, powerful system like we have for generations, the errors they sort of lurk in the databases. And as soon as you build a nice, clever, joined up, interoperable system, you begin to see the dangers of that for all sorts of things. You now can't access healthcare because you somehow fallen foul of a maternity suit or paternity suit in another area of the state's databases.
Thanks, Keith. I think those are some interesting food of thought for us. And I think lots for also the panel, for us, I will definitely come back to you with some questions. Maybe I'll try and turn to Sriti now in terms of, I think, Luca and Keith gave very different starting points for DPI in terms of, what the political, social, legacy set of context was in that space. And I'm curious, and I think some of the points that were raised really was around sovereignty, around security and governance, around transparency, access to data in order to kind of build robust systems. So I'm curious from your research and your experience, what do you think are some of the prerequisites as far as regulation and governance is concerned to really build a people-centered DPI?
Thanks, Dia. Such a pleasure to be a part of such a stellar panel. Let me just begin by introducing, the organization I'm with, Interledger Foundation, in case people don't know of them. It's a non-profit that works on financial inclusion and open payments, but I should caveat the views I'm expressing here are my own as a researcher and civil society participant from India. And I'm going to try and address that and also speak to some of the points that were made earlier by, first saying what is the good of the moment that we are in, this momentum that we are seeing around DPI. As Keith said, not all of it is new, not all these interventions are new. But what is new is the firepower that's going behind it from the highest levels, right? The countries, but also at the level of UN, thinking about safeguards, thinking about a push for openness, inclusivity, and all of that is fantastic. I think that's, a good direction to be going in. But I want to, add some observations around, what could be done better. And I think the first thing I want to bring in is, if you think about the participants in this ecosystem broadly, for the state, the markets, the civil society, and the actual public, who is the, the beneficiary ultimately of, supposed to be the beneficiary of, all of these developments. And there is this very strong state-market alliance that we are seeing, both in terms of the implementation of DPI, in terms of how it's being developed, how it's being rolled out, but also in terms of the philosophy behind DPI, right? So if in the Indian context, we often see the entities which are developing DPI being called as a startup in the government, right? So there is this valorization of the idea of startup, of the idea of markets. Aadhaar, which is our digital ID program, has been called as a poverty killer app. So a lot of phrases, a lot of thinking philosophy coming from this idea, valorization of the way the Silicon Valley has developed. But also, as Lucas said, it's a counter to the way Silicon Valley has developed and proliferated in all over the global south in particular. So DPI is in that sense both a counter but also runs the risk of following some of that same playbook. And I think that's the first thing we need to be a little worried about. And in my work, I to use this concept of an alt big tech. So in the process of being a pushback against big tech, could we be creating another ecosystem which is pursuing scale in the same reckless manner, which is really blind to due process, really blind to other things in the pursuit of reaching scale fast? So I think those are things to be conscious about in the DPI story. The second thing I want to focus on is when we talk about the public in DPI, there are many interpretations, as Lucas said. Is it public in terms of ownership? Is it public in terms of the deployment landscape? But I think the really important question is it public in terms of the participation? And there again, the question is, when we are thinking about the global south context, very often we are in ecosystems where things like regulatory impact assessment, cost-benefit analysis are not part of the day-to-day culture. And there are exceptions like the TRAI in India, which has this very robust culture of transparency and accountability in its regulation-making process. But that's unfortunately not something which trickles down to all agencies, and it's certainly not something we've seen in the deployment of the DPI process. So it has been very much a top-down sort of approach, and that's something to think about. The linked point of that is really, the role of civil society in all of this. And I think the fundamental question of who is civil society, right? Usually you think of civil society by definition as something which is, separate from the state and markets. It's a voluntary association of people who assemble around certain values, but those values could be very different. The values could be about, that the route for empowerment is through market-based mechanism, and that's one value. Or the value could be that you need to push for more human rights and think about, that's another value. And I think it's open for debate which value is better than the other, but it is important to have space for both these values reflected in the platform. And sometimes it does happen that, certain allied values find a space in internal debates, but values which are not aligned either have to resort to the media or have to resort to courts to find a voice. So I think that's an important conversation to shift that and really bring in some, first principles, accountability, participation. And the final point I want to make from the Indian experience, I think I've been a bit dull and negative in what I've said, but I want to bring in a point about the value of social construction. Right, so much of what we are thinking about DPI from different perspectives is about techno-determinism. There are some people who think like this is the path to, to kind of empowerment, to inclusion. There are some people who think this is the path, a sure path to a decline in human rights. But there is a counter view that there is a process of social construction that is happening in the DPI deployment. I'll give the example of Aadhaar in the Indian context. So when it was first deployed, the idea from the agencies was that this would just be a number, this would not be a card, right? But when society accepted it, they said, we actually need a card. We are used to a card as a form of identity. And, over time, the way it was accepted by society and by the authority was that now it is accepted as a form of card. Similarly, several other features like, initially, whenever you would use your Aadhaar, you would use those digits and, that particular number. But over time, a virtual version of it has emerged as a part of the pushback, as a part of the questions by, before the court. The idea that, can you have a masked ID where instead of revealing your main ID everywhere, you just reveal this virtual ID. So there has been positive social construction which has taken place. But again, coming back to the question of participation, very often, these are brought as new mechanisms, but because they're not originating from the agency itself, they're coming back as a, as a pushback, as a way to accommodate. Sometimes they don't become the mainstream solution. And I think that's where we need to go in terms of DPI and recognizing that there is a lot of, just from experience from your own country, from each other's country. So as others do, digital ID, I think it would be valuable to look at the default as virtual ID as opposed to the main ID to learn from each other's experience. And I think that would be a positive way to proceed with DPI.
Thanks, Metis. Lots of little nuggets for me to pick up on later. Maybe I'm going to now turn to Bidisha as you're coming online. And I think I want to double-click on the question of ownership. I think we just heard different takes on it, in terms of what Brazil's experience has been in terms of, these being owned by truly public agencies, and therefore the Right to Information Act and FOIAs kind of play in that space. We are hearing sort of a mixed bag of reactions in terms of DPIs elsewhere, where maybe the public agency is not fully in terms, or fully present in terms of the ownership of the system. And I think just to build on that, DPIs are also highly modular systems, right? It's not just one big technology. There's multiple parts to it, multiple stakeholders at play. And to Smriti's point, really this conversion from, are we actually creating another monopoly in order to tackle, sort of the existing monopoly, right? So how do we think about monopolization and ownership in this space as well? So I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more to that in terms of, your research, how you're thinking about how do we truly make DPI a public interest technology and a public-facing technology, and how should policymakers, civil society, and other stakeholders be thinking about ownership within the DPI architecture?
Thank you, Dia, and thank you everyone for, I think they've all made excellent points. I don't know how much new things I can add to the points that have already been made. But just to respond to the question of ownership and publicness in DPI, I want to underline, at least in the Indian context, the role, very important role of the state in, in conceptualizing and implementing DPI. And not just building on Aadhaar, but if you look at UPI and then other efforts, even though there has been very, very close partnership between the state and the market, which is also not new in the Indian context and elsewhere, state-market partnership has always been there. But particularly in case of DPIs, I think there are three specific roles that the Indian state has played. And they have been very clear in owning this DPI up, even though there has been considerable amount of effort by, I would say, the software industry partnership in India. And I see these three roles as creating an institutional space, like even the creation of NPCI to, push forward the agenda of financial innovation or digitalization of financial products. The state and the RBI has played a very important role in creating that kind of an institutional space where the DPI-like innovation can take place. The second has been in implementation of DPIs or pushing for implementation of DPI and specifically scaling this up, came through very, very clear state policy. So Aadhaar was mandated for all welfare, right? So this cannot happen. This kind of scale cannot be achieved without the intervention of the state. The same we see for UPI, that all, the fact that all welfare accounts needs to be connected to a mobile phone number and a zero balance bank account. That created that whole scale of public who will now be the market for financial innovation or digital financial inclusion. So here the state played very important role for scaling up DPI or even creating the possibility of scaling up something like an UPI. And the other role that the state plays is regulatory role, that how to regulate this multi-stakeholder ecosystem that we have, how to regulate each of these stakeholders. But having said that, so I think in the case of India, the state has been very much there in terms of subsidizing the infrastructure on which these are built, in regulating these infrastructural spaces and stakeholder, and also scaling up this infrastructure to much of the Indian population, let's say. But I think the word of caution that I would just put here, that while the state does play an important role, and I think that should play an important role, especially in a global majority, where the role of the state in bringing in development, bringing in inclusion is more, should be more explicitly realized. But the caution here, I'll just take the example of UPI in this case. So one of the things that came out of our research is that when the state is regulating and when you are relying on a very, very global digital infrastructure or global digital platform, there is already very, very big players. So I understand that DPI is kind of thought as an alternative to big tech, this question of digital sovereignty. But to what extent the big tech can, you can create an alternative infrastructure, and I mean the software and the technological infrastructure, which is truly independent of the big tech, is something we need to really explore and ask more carefully. For example, one of the things that came up in our study of UPI in India is that even though it is seen as something which is owned by the state, to some extent subsidized by the state, scaled by the state, the major traffic that controls the UPI ecosystem, or at least the volume of transaction, is GPay. So much so that many of the vendors, small-scale vendors that we interview, they don't even think of UPI as a public infrastructure. They kind of synonymously think of it as a Google infrastructure. So, even without knowing much about it, because that's what they use constantly, like GPay, PhonePe. PhonePe is a Walmart subsidiary. So they call this infrastructure as GPay or as PhonePe. So they don't even think of it as an UPI, which is owned by the state, or maybe not owned by, maintained and sustained by the state. So I think that is where it becomes very critical to understand or even explore that how do we actually circumvent the influence of the big tech when we rely on an infrastructure where the big tech interests are so much more embedded already. I think so that's a cautionary tale with which I will stop.
Thanks, Vidisha. I think we've heard quite a bit from our non-state stakeholders, if I may, as the term of the multilateral space goes. In terms of the various iterations of DPI, questions around ownership, questions around sovereignty, some positive, some sort of cautionary tales. So it's been quite a mixed bag, and I think that's really great because I think it starts demonstrating that not all DPI is the same. It is supposed to be different, and it isn't this monolithic technology that just gets replicated around the world. And I think that's a really important piece of that puzzle. But I will now turn to our government stakeholders, perhaps, in terms of, you've heard quite a bit from the various panelists here, and maybe I'll start with you, Mr. Singh, in terms of, India has come up quite a bit in this conversation, as it should. I think India has been such a leader in the DPI space in terms of really setting that mark, demonstrating how it's possible for a global majority country to pull something like that together. And a very deliberate role of the state in terms of tackling issues of inclusion, of whether it's financial inclusion, whether it is identity inclusion, whether it is socioeconomic inclusion. There's been multiple layers of that. But we've also heard these concerns around ownership, these questions around what is really the role of the state, how does the state work with the broader software ecosystem, and perhaps what are some of the regulatory considerations as the state thinks about scaling this technology. So maybe I'll turn to you to kind of respond a bit to that. And just one add-on to that question is I know, while the DPI infrastructure is a very national, domestic play, India has also been leading in kind of making it global, right? So I'm curious also, as you're thinking through your response, how does India see sort of its learnings nationally play out in terms of the global scaling of the technology, and particularly some of the principles that it carries forward?
Thank you, dear. I would just like to start with the problem statement, what actually we are looking at to solve. Because a lot of the times we go directly to the issues related to privacy and secrecy and all the things. But the problem, and particularly in India, what we were actually looking at is a large section of population which was not having access to the public services. So this was the main driving theme. And when we embarked on this journey of DPI, I think most of us were not aware that this will be named as DPI at all. So because Aadhaar came back way back in, I think, 2009, 2010. And that actually laid the foundation of the present day DPI is what we are having. So the basic requirement to give public services to the down the pyramid to everybody, access to the public services was the basic requirement through which this journey started. And once we had the Aadhaar digital identity, and in the present case, we already almost 1.33 billion Indians are having the Aadhaar digital identity. And that forms the basis of all our services which are extended to. And once these services are available, it is being used by not only those who were earlier not basically accessing these services, it is being used by it has become a citizen-centric services now. So when we embarked, now we are a lot of, in the world, it is being discussed actually what DPI is and what should be the foundational principles of these DPI has to be. But as far as we are concerned, we have our own foundational principles when we embarked our journey. And let me say that as we negotiate, as we travel, as we implement, as we learn, we always have some aspects which we change and introduce in our systems. So nothing becomes, you can say that it is not like things being cast in stone. Based on our experiences, there has been some judicial pronouncements also. And based on those, we make changes in our systems and we try to be transparent. So the basic principles which we actually have in our systems, I would just like to go through, maybe in case of taking the risk of repetition also, that we have certain principles like eliminate economic, technical, and social barriers. Then the system has to be modular and scalable. Key privacy-enhancing technologies and security features within the core design to ensure individual privacy, data protection, and resilience based on standards. And then we have laws, regulations, and policies should ensure that these systems are transparently governed and promote competition. So these are the basic principles through which we have been building our DPIs. The government has been the major source of inspiration, major source of finance also in these cases. But I'll not say that it is basically driven by government. There are a lot of individuals, lot of organizations who are participating and helping us build the DPIs. Now, once we have this DPIs in place, I just wanted, because we have an experience of already implementing and achieving the scale, which we can showcase to the world at large. And what are the changes it actually makes to the society? I'd just like to give some details of that. But before that, once the Aadhaar was in place, digital identity was in place, we had a challenge of how to provide a financial inclusion to the large section of the society. Most of the Indians, maybe about 10 years back, they were not having bank accounts also. Mm-hmm. So we went through this digital identity of Aadhaar, and in India, we open an account maybe in less than half a minute. The KYC is being done through Aadhaar, and account is opened, and that account gets mostly operated through a mobile. So there was in parallel, the 4G was being implemented all over India, mobile phones, and the broadband was actually proliferating at a very fast pace. And digital identity people got, the accounts were being opened, and in the Jan Dhan account, what we call, is the zero balance account which is being opened. The present count is 550 million. So this is the number. So these people who are basically out of any financial inclusion, they got a platform. It is just a mind-boggling figures which I am actually quoting. And so many people were out of the banking system. And just because we had these DPIs, we had these platforms, the financial inclusion of large proportion of our population actually happened. Once they were part of the banking system, there were a lot of benefits government was giving, which came to their accounts. Money was getting transferred to their accounts. Right from building toilets in the villages to building houses in the villages, and pensions were being given. So the experience of India was not very good in giving these benefits to the people because a lot of the proportion of it was being siphoned off. So the direct benefit transfer actually came into being. And then UPI happened. UPI happened much at a later date while we had an Aadhaar identity. We had this Jan Dhan account. And what UPI did was that the transaction through the mobile bank happened at a very fast pace. So people adopted, they had an account, so they were able to transact. So these things actually happened, and now, in fact, the last month of, I am having the details, 18.77 billion transactions worth $290 billion. That is only for the month of 2025. So the adoption of UPI has been so fast because we had a system of accounts, we had a system of digital identity already in place. And then now India is actually building upon all these advantages. There are 3 or 4 examples which I just need to quote to give it, the context to our audiences today. That we have a GEM, that is Government E-Marketplace, where most of you may be aware that the state, federal, and the state governments is one of the biggest procurement of services and goods. In our case, there has been a DPI built on that, which we call GEM, and the facilities of procurement of goods and services to all the state governments and the federal government actually happens through that. And if I just give the figures, there are 11,000 products, 336 services, 1,64,000 buyers, and for last year, that is from the April of 2024 to March of 2025, there was a procurement of $625 billion through that. So, and what has happened is, actually, before that, there was a small group of suppliers. They had actually controlled the market of procurement, the government was procuring through them. It has basically democratized the suppliers. It has enabled a person sitting in a village, a person sitting there in the remote part of the country to become a supplier to the government. This is how actually the transition is happening. Then I don't know how many of you would be aware of open network of digital commerce, ONDC, which is being implemented. We have seen actually the platforms which are basically which provide e-commerce have not been very democratic in nature. There are issues with small and medium enterprises to actually come on board on them. So this ONDC also is being made for actually, it doesn't actually stops at, or it doesn't say that larger ones cannot come to our platform, but it actually enables small and medium enterprises to actually, it enables them to participate in the e-commerce activity. We have in fact, a very popular Ayushman Bharat scheme, what we call, where this health benefits are being given to the common public, and the number is also, I would just like to quote, is 787 million. And there are 409,000 health facilities which have been registered, and 648,000, that is 648,000 health professionals. So what it has done, that you have an Ayushman Bharat card, you want to avail the facilities of the hospital. Hospitals are registered by the government. Health professionals are registered by the government. You go to all these hospitals which are on board, show your card, give your number, and you get the facilities, and the payment is done through, the government does the payment for that. And this is all seamless, cashless. This is basically the basic facilities being extended to a common citizen. And earlier, if you just imagine the numbers and imagine whether it can be done without a DPI in place, the answer is absolutely no. So in India, we had no option. If we have to, the time was very short, services to be provided to the citizens was a large number of services. Whether we could have done it without DPI, the answer is no. Whether we could have waited for the definitions to be finalized, the answer is no. We have embarked on our journey. We have achieved a lot. We still learn and we implement as per our experiences and based on there is another aspect, in fact, in our G20 presidency. We had included this DPI as one of the pillars, and it was accepted with certain changes which was made during the negotiations. And I think that was the time when the world actually woke up to the DPIs and started discussing about them, although a lot of things were happening at other places, but now it is the time for all of us to sit together and to see that there has been a lot of experiences in other places also, how we can learn from them. And as far as India is concerned, we have offered free of cost to any country which wants to adopt DPI platform. Our Prime Minister has offered this during the G20 presidency, and it can be adopted by any country, and we'll be very happy to actually help that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think quite a bit of background from what India's sort of problem statement was and how it kind of approached that larger ecosystem. And I think one of the things that was also interesting, I think India's G20 presidency also came right after the pandemic, when the world also felt that if governments could not deliver public services, and we were in a situation where physical infrastructures were no longer functional, then this was really the way forward. So I think many things kind of tied together and really helped propel and DPI into the spotlight. I'm going to turn to Armando, who has joined us online from the Dominican Republic. And it was very interesting to hear from Mr. Singh in terms of what India's sort of problem statement was, what was really trying to solve, and sort of the long journey it went through in terms of various iterations of what we now today know as DPI. I'm curious, Armando, you're leading a lot of the innovation that's happening in the Dominican Republic in terms of reimagining government services, reimagining public to citizen relationships, and how do we sort of rethink digital transformation? So maybe you could share a bit more about what your experiences has been in the DPI space, and also just building on the previous question, how is sort of the national priorities tying up to the more universal principles around DPI, and how is sort of Dominican Republic adopting some of those?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this amazing panel. The conversation has been very rich, and I'm more than eager to share a bit of the work that we're doing so far in the DR. For the Dominican Republic, the DPI as a concept is something that is fairly new. We basically started back in 2020 when we were thinking about how to solve societal level problems that are tied to public services, especially when it comes to data interoperability and identity and, of course, payments. So in that regard, for us, DPI is not just a set of technologies, but a nation-building tool, and one that must be grounded in rights, resilience, and trust. In that regard, basically, there are two realities that are driving our adoption on that front, which is socially, since we're responding to citizen demands for accessible and inclusive services that respect their dignity and privacy. Politically, in the sense that DPI enables a more transparent, participatory, and result-oriented government, and a state, of course. And economically, because for us, it's a letter for inclusion that is also unlocking opportunities for not just for the people on their feet, but also for small businesses, youth, women, and especially people that are in underserved areas. We realized that we can only fulfill our promise to the people when the foundations are right. And for us, that means like doing a major groundwork for having a strong legal and regulatory frameworks around data protection, interoperability, and open standards. For us to keep strengthening institutions that ensure oversight and safeguard implementation, and of course, having institutions that are involved, especially from the third sector, the civil society, private sector, that one way or another has some sort of shared responsibility on insight and oversight of the work the government is doing on that front. So from the very beginning, we started first with the most tackling issue for us, which is data interoperability. So we decided to build our own infrastructure on data exchange based on the work that the government of Estonia has done before on implementing this broad open source platform called Xroad for data exchange. We did local customization and implementation, and we are basically translating all the documentation into Spanish for institutions and eventually the private sector to understand how it works and get on board on that. Since we started implementing it in 2021, 2022, we roughly have around 71, 72 institutions that are currently using the Xroad ecosystem for data exchange. And the result has been very interesting so far. But we face now another issue, which is, of course, data governance. And now we're rethinking on how data governance actually works, not just for public services provision, but also how we can empower people on that front. And in that sense, we're working on a new set of regulations around that principle. One that is focused not just on the data protection itself, but also on the quality of the data that is actually being exchanged. So we're working on defining proper data observability and orchestration mechanisms, so we can actually make some of the principles around data protection something that should be easy enforceable, because sometimes these concepts can be very abstract and very difficult to grasp by institutions or to more operationalize on a technical level. So in that front, defining this proper set of data rules and having the right platforms alongside the data exchange mechanism for it's important, especially for them to be secure and to respect people's rights on that front. And of course, having a way for these oversight mechanisms that should be implemented from the civil society so they can keep the government accountable on the work that it's doing on that front. When it comes for identity, basically what we started doing, since the government in the Dominican Republic has the peculiar characteristic that it doesn't administrate directly the civil registry, although it's a public institution, but it's outside of the government. We have made several workarounds based on the work that we previously have done with data exchange. So what we decided was to build some sort of authentication platform starting for public services that builds on the same principles of data protection, because it's mostly focused on data minimization and just on the right of the people to authorize what kind of personal data can actually share to provide the minimum requirement for public services. So what we're doing right now is basically working closely with several institutions such as CDPI on defining a broader architecture for this digital identity infrastructure alongside the Civil Registry Authority, for us to start providing different means of not just of data protection around identity, but also how we can actually start building this sort of verified credential standard that works for everybody, and to start having these sort of documents that are actually verifiable, trustworthy, and of course administered by the right authorities at the right time. And for payments, I think this is the area that we had huge advancements, because we have like real-time payments that are actually enabled and effective and available for the universal population. But the way that it's done is not necessarily the most efficient way. So the central bank, which is the owner of the ad infrastructure, is actually looking at ways to provide a PIX-like solution for the people that is also based on those principles that we're trying to build, and of course trying to have this sort of accountability around the society, and also getting the private sector on board, so that solution, when it comes available to the people, actually gets adopted very easily and quickly. Especially since the country has serious issues when it comes to financial inclusion, because roughly half of the population is financially excluded, and those And regarding the other half that is technically included, roughly 30% are actually the ones that are receiving broader financial services from whether that's digital or not. And we are finding ways to reverse that situation. And of course, having these sort of platforms will allow, especially to do just that. Not necessarily in the way that these have solved the problem in Brazil, but it's one of the options that are actually on the table. And we hope that we're going to find ways to do this in the most inclusive way, but also having this participation for oversight and accountability from all the actors that must be involved into that part.
Thanks, Armando. I think kind of really seeing that sort of spectrum of experiences, right? Sort of, kind of India's very long journey and now kind of Dominican Republic tackling some of the more emerging challenges in this space. I will come to audience questions right after we bring Rasmus in. So if you have a burning question, now is the time to start thinking about it so that you can ask it in a few minutes. Rasmus, maybe turning to you. Estonia is sort of the other major example in the DPI space. And similar to India, I think it has a long legacy of really digitizing e-government services. In fact, e-government is by definition digital, but sort of thinking about e-government services, public to citizen delivery, and solving some of the problems that perhaps Dominican Republic is kind of going through right now, and the whole world is going to think about, how should we think about DPI? What is the right governance model? What are the different ways in which we can really, cut down some of the costs of it, right? So there's many questions on the table, but I would love to know from you, what has Estonia's experience been in this space, one, but also just to build on that, Estonia is also leading on the rights-respecting DPI principles through the Freedom Online Coalition. And so maybe if you can also tie in how Estonia has actually implemented some of those principles in its past, or how it has thought through those principles as it is now thinking about either its legacy DPI or sort of emerging DPI iterations in its work.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, maybe I should start by saying that when in the beginning, when you introduced me as being on the extreme left, I just wanted to clarify that it doesn't necessarily reflect my political views. Anyway, I think many great angles and aspects have been raised, and the questions you are posing to me now also probably would allow for hours of discussion. But of course, I will stick to just some of the main things for now, which would probably be the fundamentals of the DPI, because we have already heard a lot about the practical backgrounds of why DPI is being built and so on. So maybe I will get also to the Freedom Online Coalition's principles of the DPI, as Estonia is in 2025 the chair of the Freedom Online Coalition. But as a representative of Estonia, I definitely can give a bit of a background as to how we have built it up over the course of, for now, I think around 25 years, and how we have managed to tie the fundamentals into the actual digital solutions. So, as I said, Estonia, I think, started with its digital public infrastructure in the beginning of, I believe, 2000 or so, around 25 years ago. And this has really allowed us to see over the years how this digital public infrastructure and all this digital governance has been able to transform the society, and how it has empowered the citizens, and how it has fostered economic growth, and so on. At the same time, of course, we have always been very mindful and vigilant about the risks that this has also brought forward, and we have always tried to mitigate those risks to the best of our knowledge at every certain time or time period when something has been built. Now, many of the principles that already have also been mentioned here during previous interventions, I mean, these principles seem to be self-evident, but they don't necessarily self-evidently work within the DPI systems. And there also can be very different understandings of what does it mean, for example, privacy or security within the digital public infrastructure. I will bring you one example, which would be that, for example, when we talk about privacy, then within the DPI, does that mean that the person's data or the information about the person is private to the outside users? Or is it also private on the inside of the DPI, meaning that is there any control or checks and balances on how the, so to speak, the owner of the DPI or the government, how they can access this information about the person? I think these are two different concepts, and that's why, for example, what we have done in Estonia is that one of the very key principles for our DPI is that every citizen is the owner of their own data and has full control of it. In practice, it means that any user, any Estonian citizen can at any time verify which government official or any other person has accessed their personal data within the DPI systems. So this is our way of trying to make sure that there is like preventive accountability for the use of personal data within the DPI. Now, in practice, there are also some other important elements which we have prioritized from the very beginning, and one, of course, would be interoperability, meaning that Estonia's digital public infrastructure works on a platform which is called Crossroad, and the point is that this is a platform that allows for all different institutions to manage their own systems, but they're all interconnected on the same platform, allowing for the citizen to actually be able to access everything from one place, and as I said already, being able to control their own data. Then what was also mentioned and what we have already done since the very beginning is the e-identity, and this is the key or the central part of the whole system, which allows for the people to actually access all the services. And also, I mean, in the case of Estonia, it has already also been taken so far as to be able to participate electronically in the elections and so on. The so-called i-voting, internet voting, we can do it on the computer as well. At the same time, we have been trying to maximize the possibility for people to access all government services, or, well, I don't know if they can be called necessarily government services, but public services, to close in on having 100% of the services being able to be accessed by people, and I think, not sure, but I think divorce is now, I think, the only thing that we cannot do online yet. But I think as the society develops, then that will be possible as well. But now, not to waste too much time, just I would run very quickly through the Freedom Online Coalition's work currently, which is for this year in the program of action. Estonia, as the chair, has prioritized rights respecting DPI principles, which obviously would be something that we have already naturally kind of built into our digital public infrastructure. And as the chair of the Freedom Online Coalition, we are hoping that the coalition could could bring this to the global attention as well. Many of those principles, as I said before, are quite natural. There is one thing that that is extremely natural, but you cannot write it into anything. It's not a standard, and you cannot even put it as a principle. And this is called trust. The public trust is something that is actually the most important thing. You can force people to do anything, but without trust, you will not get the most out of whatever you're building, because people will not want to use it. But anyway, so trust we have not been able to include into the principles, but what we have included in the principles are the notions of human-centered solutions, meaning that everything has to be focused on humans when we develop technology or digital solutions. Everything must serve this objective. Then something very important, which is inclusivity. And we are feeling very strongly about everybody's need to have access to the internet, to all the digital services and skills in order to be able to benefit from digital transformation. Then we believe that international human rights standards should be followed because otherwise there are too many risks that we will immediately take in undermining the possibility of trust in these discussions. Transparency and accountability, I think, speak for themselves. Everybody probably realizes that we need this to minimize the negative impact of technologies on human rights. Privacy and security we have already talked about. Then societal context. I think everybody agrees that their own societies, their own communities need to be respected with their own particularities and so on. And this is also very important to make any digital public infrastructure work effectively, to take into account the societal context. Then sustainability and resilience. And this is because it is important to build sustainable programs and to be able to maximize long-term impact. Data-driven. DPI must be data-driven because we want to ensure that quality information is available for decision-making. Interoperability, that I mentioned in our case as well, we do want to promote interoperable systems which work together seamlessly across organizations. It will make everything cheaper, it will make everything more effective, it will be easier for both the users and the administrators or managers of the systems. Then, of course, technology neutrality, because we believe that the digital public infrastructure should be built in a technology neutral manner. Openness, of course, open approach to digital development. It means open standards, open source, open data. This is something that will nicely tie in with privacy and security. And finally, of course, collaboration, meaning both collaboration domestically and also on the international level. So these are the principles the Freedom Online Coalition is currently working on. We hope to be able to adopt them during this year, and then they may be able to serve as some like a guiding light to everybody who wishes to further develop their own digital public infrastructure. Thank you.
Thanks, Rasmus. A very comprehensive set of principles, I think, for all of our stakeholders to think through. We've reached, we don't have a lot of time for our panel, so I'm curious if anybody in the audience here has any questions that they would like to ask the panel. There's mics there, but we're also a very intimate room, so also I think I can hear if people are speaking.
Or maybe if online also.
We actually have an online question, but I wanted to make sure there's anybody. Okay, great. I think we have an online question. I think Rasmus touched on it a little bit more, so maybe. Oh, there is. Okay, yes. Thank you.
You should take the mic.
Yeah, maybe the mic will be useful.
Thank you very much for this insightful question. My name is Elizabeth. My first, I have two questions, if you don't mind. My first question is to Professor Belli. Thank you very much for the insights around like collaboration between government and other stakeholders. I had worked with the government of Nigeria on digital policy reforms, one of which was digitizing business registration processes to reduce the time, the cost, and the procedure of doing business. And my experience with public service is there's still that gap in terms of building that sort of entrepreneurial mindset in seeing how this could be of great benefit and then fully owning this service, service delivery to the public. So I now currently work with a mobile industry association, and the big question is for telcos, mobile network operators, what are like the opportunities in terms of collaborating with government, because there's this buzz around mobile data. Increasingly, mobile devices are becoming very instrumental in increasing access to public services, to digital services across the world, especially in emerging markets. So I don't know if you could share some examples and some insights on that. That would be great. The second question I have is to Professor Breckenridge from the session on South Africa, and also to Simriti, I'm so sorry, I try my best to pronounce it properly, and is on digital financial inclusion. So the comment around us really thinking through on how we can guard against digital financial inclusion not being a risk, more or less an innovation addressing the problem as opposed to being a risk for misuse, abuse, data harvesting, and the likes. And it got me thinking around AI ethics and transparency. And my question is to Professor Breckenridge, in South Africa, what would you say are like top priorities in terms of building this very strong AI ethical standards around that? And for Simriti, I'm sorry once again, is in the context of digital financial inclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before I go to the panelists to respond to this question, we also have some online questions along the same lines, so maybe I can tie the two questions together just in the interest of time. I think we also have an online question that is also asking similar approaches to how do we actually weave in some of the human rights principles within the DPI architecture. And then particularly just speaking on the AI piece, we are now also seeing a moment where using the existing DPI, a lot of AI developments are happening, a lot of API access is being provided, and sort of that architecture is also scaling some of the AI expansion, particularly in the global majority. So as we think about these expansions, how do we actually weave in some of these principles that Rasmus mentioned, but also some of the learnings that we have had in the past? And where do the different stakeholders that we have, whether it's civil society, technical communities, what could their different roles be? So that's a question from the online audience, and maybe it'll be a good way to kind of weave them in. So maybe, Luca, since we can start with you, and then I can maybe turn to some of the other speakers.
Yeah, I think those questions are excellent and actually allow me to delve a little bit more into the details of what could be the success or the failure of this kind of efforts. I think that as anything in digital, one has to consider that we are dealing with systems, right? There are a lot of elements and a lot of layers. I like the India stack vision because it revisualizes that the system has layers and you have to consider them all to be successful. And I think that this is one of the reasons why the Brazilian Central Bank was successful in implementing PIX. The other reason is because they are a very independent, well-resourced institution, which is key for the success of the DPIs, knowing that the institution that implement them understand what they are doing, they have the resources to do this, both intellectual and financial resources to stimulate this, and they are able to implement it with other stakeholders. So this is a very good example of how multi-stakeholder cooperation can work. And in the case of PIX and the Brazilian Central Bank, they really understood that it was not only the PIX, but it was how the PIX was introduced, and they understood very well the system. Let me give you a very concrete example of why. So Brazil, as most Global South countries, although Brazil has a very good level of connectivity, most of the country is not meaningfully connected. As most of the Global South, we are connected through zero-rated services, primarily the Meta family of services, so social media, and all the rest is very expensive. So if you want to introduce a new digital service, government, a DPI, people will not use it because they have to spend money. And that is why when the Brazilian government was going to introduce PIX and Meta proposed to introduce WhatsApp payment 3 months before the PIX, the Brazilian central bank had the power to block this and to postpone Meta introduction of WhatsApp payment after the PIX entered in force due to competition, data protection, and consumer protection reasons. So they understood very well that if WhatsApp had introduced WhatsApp payment before the PIX, today we would not be celebrating the PIX as a great success. Everyone in Brazil would be using WhatsApp payment. And that leads me also to celebrate another great success of India, and I think that colleagues from the Telecoms Regulatory Authority of India should be really praised for their vision in 2016 when they adopted very strong net neutrality rules that prohibited zero rating in India. And I think that the reason why the DPIs have been so successful in India, and I think this is the greatest untold story of good digital sovereignty. India prohibited zero rating in 2016. It's the only global south country that did this, and the result is not only that connectivity prices have dropped by 90%, and connectivity has boomed, more than 300% of adoption and increase in the past 8 years, but also that India is experiencing a belle epoque of innovation. Why? Because you can access everything. You don't have only social media for free and all the rest extremely expensive. Everything is cheap. And that is something that you need to consider. So you need really to have a systemic vision before thinking about the DPI. And also you need to have an institution that is able to implement that vision. And we had this chance in Brazil with the Brazilian Central Bank. I'm not sure all other institutions would be able to do this same success.
Thanks, Lucas. Ritumi, I'll turn to the question specifically to you and the role of different stakeholders in that process.
Yeah, thanks for that question. On the financial inclusion question and stakeholders in that process, I think it's an important question to think about what were the causes of exclusion. And I think to the extent ID was a cause, we have seen DPIs addressing that, but there is, I think, an underlying question that, what sort of ID did you need? Do you necessarily need a biometric-based ID to solve for financial inclusion? I think those are the debates to be had. Like certainly, have recognition and being able to verify and identify is a building block. The other question, I think, which is important to the DPI conversation is about, how do you define financial inclusion? Is it only about payments and remittances? A lot of the DPI focus is around that, or is it about a broader bouquet of financial services? And are we thinking about, insurance? Are we thinking about, other services which are also a part of financial inclusion? And finally, with digitization, the frauds that we are seeing, the cyber risk that we are seeing, are we thinking about DPI on those fronts? So far, we don't very actively. We seem to be solving those through DPI, and I think that's where, the next layer of thinking should be.
Thanks, Priti. Keith, there's a question specifically for South Africa as well, from your experience. And then maybe just... Sorry? Go ahead.
I don't think it's a South African question. I think it's a global question. And for me, the first question is the liability question. Who should take responsibility? Someone finds out your information on Facebook, uses a network provider to send you an enticing SMS. You click on the link, and then your pension fund is gone, And this is happening, let's be honest, it's happening to, a significant proportion of the populations that are meant to be basically getting resources and capabilities from this. And I think it may be I'm the age, so I'm 60, which means I spend quite a lot of time working with people who are 85, 90, old people, the normal old people who are the actual targets. They're not 25-year-old Estonians, they're 80-year-old Africans, and they really don't have the skill set that they need, that the designers of these systems are assuming are actually available to them. They don't see the buttons, they can't read the text. It's so easy for them to be robbed. I mean, it's truly a joke. And no one is really looking at this. No one wants to take it seriously. The only people who are, of course, are the English. The British are doing this, and they've imposed an £85,000 liability on the banks, regardless of what happens. Someone empties your bank account, the banks are responsible. And that's, as far as I can see, the only country in the world that's doing that. And when we start talking about sharing liability, the network providers will stop allowing criminal SMSs to flow on their systems. Then we can talk. So if we're doing this let's be aware of what we're doing. We're building an infrastructure that's going to make a huge population newly vulnerable to really serious crimes, and there's no discussion of what we should be doing about that. So I would start with that. I think that the second issue for me is really the question about asset creation. I'm much more worried about asset creation than I am about what we could call usurious, interest rates. It's people need to be getting something out of these mobile systems. It's not enough to make it a kind of subsistence question. We have to look for how people can buy things, material things that they can keep and not turn it towards consumption. And that for me is fundamentally a matter of fiduciaries and also these kind of collective forms of savings association that are very common everywhere. You find them of one kind or another. They're very normal, but DPI privileges what we call individual biographical credit surveillance. It gives you an ID number that makes the ID number the core of the credit scoring system. It's also one of the reasons why everywhere, even in the US, firms are much less visible. That's the real problem we've got here. And again, I'd like to hear the engineers who are building this huge infrastructure that's putting us all at risk speak about the implications of that.
Thanks, Keith. In the interest of time, maybe I'm going to, probably not come back to Sriti, Luca, and Keith, but actually give Bidisha, Armando, Mr. Singh here, and Rasmus a chance to give their closing remarks with like one quick question, which is also from the participants, is really how do we think about weaving in these principles into DPI governance? Some are very legacy systems, some are newer systems. So how do we actually do it? So maybe a quick 30-second, I'll start with Rasmus.
Well, I will use my 30 seconds to maybe be quiet. I don't know how to actually do it. I can only maybe refer to or reuse something I said 10 years ago, and with reference with what Keith was mentioning about old people, young people, that I am firmly confident that old people are not as stupid as we think they are, and young people are not as smart as we think they are, even in digital.
Fair point. Bidisha.
Yeah, I also don't have a profound thought, last, closing statement. But I think one thing that in the discussion we see that India being this success story in terms, or other countries being success story in terms of how many people have bank accounts or how many people so my broader question would be like, is digitalization equal to inclusion? Is the question that I think I would end with.
Thanks, Bidisha. Armando.
Well, building on the same statements that preceded me, basically, I just want to remark that to earn people's trust, DPIs must be more than efficient. It must be ethical, inclusive, and accountable. And that means that the safeguards, on AI, on the broad DPI effort, should be codified into law, should be embedded into law, ensuring that civil society has a seat on the table, and making systems transparent and auditable. We in the Dominican Republic, we're actually trying to do that. We're committed to building a DPI, not just as a government infrastructure, but rather a civic infrastructure that are governed not just by code, but by values that protects people and empowers them to achieve their very best. That's all I can say.
Thanks, Armando. Over to you, Mr. Singh. Last word.
I would just like to say that any DPI or any system which is being built has to be user-centric, citizen-centric, and the goal and the principles have to be to how the society is to be served. That is the basic principles, and everything else can be actually built. There are no issues.
Great, wonderful. On that closing thought of building people-centered DPI, thank you everyone for joining in on our panel. I'm sure lunch is being served right now, so I hope to continue the conversation. Thank you for online participants for joining and staying on, and look forward to the next IGF. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.